Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 51st episode of Beyond Talking Point, excuse me, with Matt and Matt. Today, we are going to begin by having a conversation on anti-natalism. If we have time, we'll also touch on a very different topic, jury nullification. But before I begin, anyone listening or watching this podcast, I want to apologize for my hoarse voice. I have a bad cold. Um, but it's not the Rona because I got that checked out. But as I was joking to my co-host off air, that's a good that's a good jumping off point to a conversation on anti-natalism, um, because the anti-natalists are these very it's a very interesting philosophy, a very unique philosophy that gives a negative value to life, or a negative value to birth at least. Um, the idea is that it would be better if Matt and I and everyone we know had never been born, simply because the there is so much suffering out there in the world. I have a cold right now, but if I had never been born, I wouldn't know what colds are, or I would never experience colds because I would never experience anything because I wouldn't exist. Um, uh, David Benatar is a one of the prime proponents of antinatalism. He wrote a book. I think it was titled, "What is it? It is better." I forget the title off the top of my head, actually. But it's a well-known book in the antinatalist community. Um, and the argument he gives is quite interesting, because he has this little chart. It's like a Punnett. If anyone remembers in, like, middle school biology class when we had like those Punnett squares. Um, it's not a Punnett square, but it on one column it evaluates, what it's the good and bad aspects of existence, and in the other column it evaluates the good or bad aspects of non-existence. Um, and so when you exist, if you have pleasurable experiences, that's good. If you suffer, that's bad. If you don't exist, and you don't have you don't suffer, and that's good. But you don't experience pleasure, but that's not bad. So that's the kind of wrench David Benatar throws in the gears. He says it's not bad for you to not experience pleasure simply because you don't exist. Um, and I guess I'll give that's my best explanation, or my best way of kind of putting antinatalism into words. Did you want to add any thoughts related to the definition and arguments related to it and whatnot?
I think that was a good way of kicking us off, and I think you laid out most the main points. He does another, I guess, contentious thing we'll probably touch on, at least to some extent, is he really draws the huge distinction between if you're already alive or if you haven't been born yet. And that's kind of like the most common, like if you're going to do the straw man of the arguments against antinatalism, it's the person who's like, well, then why don't you just kill yourself then if life is so bad? Because being dead and non-existing is supposed to be a zero. So like, why don't you just go to that then if life is so miserable? And it's not that that's necessarily the worst point, because the reason why somebody would say that straw man is because there's kind of a hint of truth to it to some degree, but he dances around it, and I'm content with the way he dances around it. He's more of just saying there's no reason why the burden on having been born has to applies to people who are already currently living, and that's actually weirdly ties in with well, I guess I might be getting ahead of myself by going into too much commentary there. But if we were going to sum up the main two, I guess, tenets, I guess, of what David Benatar brings to the table, I'd probably say that distinction I just pointed out, and then the matrix you were talking about um, the pros and cons of being born, and then the pros and cons of never existing, and how he tries to kind of, I would say he tries to have it both ways. Do you want to go into maybe how well, it might be a good place to get into your first, I guess, objections, or where you think he's onto something, and then we'll go from there.
I think antinatalism is an example of a philosophy which, and this is true of I'm noticing of quite a bit of arguments among philosophers. Their argument can be completely logical and make sense, when you evaluate it on its own terms. But that doesn't necessarily make it right or helpful, if you understand the distinction I'm making. Um, but that's kind of, I'm not even saying that necessarily just in the sense of, well, not most people are never going to be antinatalists, although that is I think an objection worth mentioning. um I mean, my intuitions do diverge from antinatalists, um I guess because that I'm not sure that it's always helpful to view life from a narrowly logical lens. That might sound like a strange way to kind of attack antinatalism, but at some level, it's like the antinatalists are just looking at life from they're looking at life in such a way which is too logical, um, too. I mean, and as we all know, I mean, and I'm not saying like being illogical. So I guess what I'm trying to say then, at some level, um, there are illogical aspects built into human life, or built into mankind, or built into existence, um, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. And that doesn't necessarily mean we shouldn't do X, Y, or Z just because X, Y, or Z isn't logical. But I guess to kind of give the devil his due for a second, um, I mean, there are reasons to kind of think more about antinatalism. I mean, overpopulation could become a problem, um, be, due to the fact that either we're not good at distributing resources properly, or just because the more people on the planet, or we could get to a place where there are more people on the planet than the planet can sustain, and that would lead to a great deal of suffering, for one thing. There is, and I think I would agree with the antinatalists when they say that it's not like not existing is not necessarily bad in and of itself. But I do think I can see certain value in, and I think you can even make like logical arguments in favor of a certain value to existence. But I guess I brought up the part about like life is not always logical, because it can be hard to do that kind of utilitarian calculus of how much good or bad there is in life.
Okay, so I will qualify with what I said with, I missed about 10 seconds of what you said because of issues on my end, but I fixed it. So I hope I don't misinterpret what you were saying, or accidentally repeat a point you were making. But I think what you're getting at here is when you have you have the matrix that Benatar lays out, where scenario A is where someone exists, and then you have the minus, which is the presence of pain, and you have the plus, which is the presence of pleasure. And then where scenario B is where you don't exist, he says the plus is the absence of pain, and then he gives 0 to the absence of pleasure. He doesn't consider that a minus. So if you accept that matrix is valid, then you can argue that you don't even have to do the cost benefit analysis to some degree. If you're a consequentialist, I think you have to do it no matter what. You have to do the cost benefit analysis. And then this is why I kind of find antinatalism very interesting, is I think you end up with something similar to the Austrian economics term, which is like the socialist calculation problem. And this is something that like Hayek will talk about too, where he talks about how when you try to centrally plan somebody, you don't actually get appropriate signals of what people's preferences are. So if you actually have to do a calculus of very individual people that haven't existed yet, then you run into this problem of, can you actually do a valid cost benefit analysis? And I don't know if you ended up watching it, but the David Benatar Jordan Peterson their whole discussion is really just Jordan Peterson accusing David Benatar of rigging that cost benefit calculus. Now, I think where it gets hairy for like people like me, where a lot of my ideology is don't harm people, and as long as you don't harm people, you're good. If you look at Benatar's matrix and you accept it, he is saying the presence of pain in existence is bad. So if you bring anything in the world, there is that, that bad on them. And if they never bring somebody to existence, there's only the positive of the absence of pain. I'm just not content with the way that Benatar tries to square the circle of the positive of the absence of pain, but it being a zero for the absence of pleasure. And he tries to square that circle, and he does a lot of philosopher-like wordplay, but I don't think it really. I still don't buy it, and that's really where that's really where it becomes a problem for me when I try to listen to him argue his points. So that's why I kind of don't want to give it too much credit for being like supremely logical, even though I think that's a big problem in philosophy, because I don't even necessarily think the logic holds up. If you're getting what I'm trying to get at. So that's kind of where I stood on my, I guess, first impression of it. And I think that's kind of around what you're getting at too.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought up the mismatch, I guess, between his ideas of pleasure versus pain or suffering, because I think so. I was listening to I didn't finish the whole thing, but I didn't get to listen to the Jordan Peterson versus David Benatar conversation, but I listened to a good portion of the Sam Harris David Benatar conversation. And Sam Harris brought up a point. Sam Harris is always doing these thought experiments when he's talking to everyone, and it exacerbates everyone he's talking to. I can tell. But he brought up he had this thought experiment where imagine a world where after a good portion of time, everyone or at least most people have extraordinary lives, and every day is at some level better than the next. An idealized view of the world. Imagine like a world where pretty much everything goes according to plan, everything is good or pleasurable. And so Sam Harris is using that thought experiment to say that well, that in that case, I think you can say there is a negative cost, or you can assign a negative value to non-existence. And so when people are critical of philosophy, they often say, well, these thought experiments don't really matter because they're just thought experiments and we're dealing with the real world. But I guess I tend to think of thought experiments as useful tools rather than empirical evaluations of reality. But I think these useful tools can help us evaluate reality to one degree or another, depending on the topic we're talking about. And so, but I'm much more in agreement with the Sam Harris camp in that respect. Because I mean, given that, so the nature of being a conscious being, a sentient being, I mean, it is kind of weird in some ways, and well, no one's going to deny that there is definitely suffering involved. And I guess I was trying. I mentioned the utilitarian calculus because it is hard to kind of say, well, it's more suffering than pain, or more suffering than pleasure, or more pleasure than suffering. But I guess I think that for most people, and I would agree with most people, the pleasure that I get out of the positive aspects of existence, I think I think they give me a reason to say, Not only do I, want to continue my life, which Benatar says is fine, and he would agree with himself. I could see some value in bringing other people into this life. Um, I don't think it's I don't think we can discount, say, the pleasures of friendship, or the beauties of art, or the wonders of the natural sciences, or just the fun speculations of philosophy. I'm kind of using intellectual pleasures here, but you can find you can insert other kinds of pleasures in there as well. Good food, uh, good movies. I see value in all of that, and I at some level, I guess I do kind of have to say, when I'm trying to, if I do that utilitarian calculus, um, I guess I do maybe emphasize the positive aspects of existence when I'm talking about whether or not existence is worthwhile. Um,
And one of the interesting things about, I guess, well, I think it's something you have to know going into reading anything about Benatar, and it's something I think is more of an aesthetic flaw of what he does, but he frames it through a lens of pleasure and pain, and it's something that Jordan Peterson knocks him on a lot. And when Jordan Peterson pushes back on like what counts as pleasure and pain, um, David Benatar does, I guess, accept that pleasure can encompass a wide variety of things. So, like if you like if you listen to Jordan Peterson talk, and I know you didn't watch the video, but you're familiar enough with Jordan Peterson to where I know that I'm not talking past you or anything. Jordan Peterson does this whole thing where he's like, you got to aim for a star, but the whole goal is you need to actualize. It's not just about responsibility. It's about you have to meet some sort of potential, and we all know when we're underperforming because we know that our potential to some degree on an intrinsic level, especially if you're a person who's above average at something, you won't be satisfied with doing what is standard because you know that you could do better. So there's like some kind of intrinsic good to knowing that you're meeting potential, but that's not something that you think of in like the hedonistic framing that seems to come from pain and pleasure. So we have Benatar kind of acknowledge this, and he accepts that pain can just be really anything bad, and you can categorize that on an individual level and then good on an individual level. But he also chooses to spend like a lot of his time arguing about certain mental things, like so an example of this would be, I think he points out how people tend to fixate on negative memories more often than positive memories, and a lot of negatives are more fleeting than positives. So like when if you're like me, you spend a lot of time watching sports, and you end up watching 162 baseball games in a season. And if you're like me, where you're a fan of the San Diego Padres, up until like the last 2 years, for most of my lifetime, they've been a pretty bad team. So I think David Benatar would point to like this, and to some degree say, well, look, every time the Padres lose, you're way more upset than you are happy when they win. And this is like a fundamental thing about sports, or about really winning and losing in anything, is people get much more upset about losing than winning. And he kind of points to this type of way that our brain emphasizes negatives as opposed to positives. And he's like, see, it's like endemic for all these sorts of biological survival reasons for us to do this, and this is what leads to the human conditioning of suffering, the human condition of suffering. But it kind of presupposes, like, I guess, the meaning or the value or the point of existing onto his line of thinking by even framing it in such a way, because you can't compare something like having important, valuable relationships and meeting your potential, and then having certain comforts with, oh, you get more upset when your sports team loses than you are happy when they win. It's like completely different. So he can point to all these micro examples that I think end up undermining ultimately his point, because it ends up framing things in like a hedonistic way, even if he's willing to accept that it's supposed to go beyond that. And I think it ends up hurting his argument more than that. Because like, if you talk to a lot of people who are our age about life, a lot of people who aren't believing in like a deity of sorts, will tend to kind of play up the hedonistic way of looking at the world. But in reality, like, a lot of it is just people in our age range haven't had a lot of relationships that, or haven't had a lot of success in careers, or haven't had certain levels of accomplishments that might actually be more tangible and valuable in a certain way. So we just can't even conceptualize things through that lens. And I don't want to accuse Benatar of being naive to those things, because he's much older than me, and he's like a professor, and he's written books and has accolades to some degree, and has had much more career success than me. But I think it's like an unintentional blind spot that is much harder to reckon with if you're trying to be a utilitarian about understanding the issue. And I think in the end, you kind of have to look at his arguments through a utilitarian lens. And I think it's just far too muddy to come to any real conclusion. But I think we kind of agree on that. I was just kind of adding a few things I noticed in. Okay, do you want to add any other things on that front?
I guess I'll add quickly. So when I think about the human experience, I see value, or when I think about like the pursuit of pleasure, for example, I think I mean it's fair to characterize pleasure into maybe like the kind of higher forms of pleasure, like having a successful career, or marrying a wonderful person or something like that, versus getting drunk with your friends, or eating a gourmet meal. And I think both of those pleasures are valid pleasures. So, and I guess I bring that up because I'm you just mentioned the hedonism, and I guess I think a certain level of hedonism or a moderate amount of hedonism is that can also be a net good. So I don't know, we talk a lot about on the podcast about like religion, let's say, I suppose sometimes something like kind of bothers me when I think about religious thinking is they say like, oh, you like never, don't do drugs, don't drink alcohol. I mean, some kinds of religion, obviously there are different religions with different prohibitions, but certain interpretations of, say, Christianity, don't go dancing, don't play card games, don't smoke, don't drink, don't do drugs, don't have sex. And I guess that bothers me because, and I'm critical of that because it takes away, or it doesn't allow the individual to have those kinds of experiences. And you can say, and I think like Epicurus, the ancient Greek philosopher, said this. You can say that like writing a philosophical treatise is more like is a greater pleasure than eating good food. Like or you can say being a virtuous person is a greater form of pleasure than eating a good meal or whatever. And that's fine, and I would probably agree with that, but that doesn't discount the fact that certain more baser desires can it's wrong to fulfill those baser desires, and it's not pleasurable. And when I'm thinking about my calculus um, of pleasure versus pain in existence, I take into account the lower pleasures and the higher pleasures, and I think that gives me a specific view on the matter.
And I'm kind of glad you brought that up, because I know we've had this discussion when we've talked about when we talked about the Harris Peterson debates, but so I can evaluate what gives me more pleasure in my life in the now to some degree of of some degree knowing what I like, so I can kind of figure out things for my own, and I'm in line with you. But I think the reason why I'm not bothered when by any of those religious subsets is just because of what I referred to before. It's like the calculation problem. It's the knowledge problem that Hayek talks about and Mises talk about. And if people do make those trade-offs and it works for them, then and this is, I think, the one of the ultimate flaws of the anti-natalist argument of doing other people's cost benefits is just you can't. Because it's all their utility. It's the reason why you can take somebody to Disneyland and it's like their favorite day out of the year, and then there are people like me who I don't want to go to Disneyland like ever again in my life. I think it's like a hellscape. So so it's just like, yeah, if somebody wants to trade those base urges or certain things, because they, as you and I both believe, into an irrational degree, find some sort of fulfillment from something else. It's like, well, it made them more fulfilled, even if I think it's dumb. And to some degree, and I'm being dismissive of it, just because I don't want to go down that whole rabbit hole of talking about religion a ton, but but I guess what I'm saying is, I think you'll bring this up, is that there is value to doing things that we feel are true, which is one of our instincts that draws us to be, I guess, more disdainful towards some things that we see as like our arbitrary beliefs that don't seem ingrained in anything. But if they get a lot out of it, in the end, it's like, who am I to really say anything as long as they're not imposing it on me? And then there are plenty of religious situations where things are definitely imposed on, and then it shapes people in negative ways. But it's not to say that there aren't a lot of people who have very healthy relationships with their beliefs, and they have very fulfilled lives. So I think that I don't know. You probably weren't saying anything like that, but I just need to clarify.
Yeah. Well, I wasn't. I was only using the religion example in the context of when I in the context of how I think about, I guess, just my life in general, and human life, or human life in general, and my life specifically. If I want to go out and order food from Wendy's every now and then because it tastes good, and maybe I'm in a little bit of a bad mood that day, it's like, okay, I want some greasy food to satiate this base desire. It's like, and so someone could come to me and be like, oh, I don't like Wendy's, or I never want to eat at Wendy's because it's unhealthy for you. And again, I don't want to go down any of the rabbit holes of religion, or whether people should do this or that. I'm just saying, when I think about, I guess, meaning in life, I would say to someone like, oh, it's fine to eat fast food every now and then. Obviously, you don't want to overdo it. You don't want to eat a Big Mac every day for 30 years, or you'll probably develop significant health problems. But okay, every now and then you want to go eat McDonald's or Wendy's or whatever, like, that's fine. And I would say that's good. I would say that's pleasurable. I would say you can do that. Um, I would say there is some value in doing that. But that's different from me saying everyone has to do that. That's not me forcing anything on. I'm not trying to force my worldview on other people. I'm saying, I think, when a religion bans people from, say, alcohol, I guess I would just say to that person or that group that, from my understanding of the human experience, there can be some benefit to not abstaining from alcohol. So that was just that was the point I was trying to drive home. It was not related at all to our ongoing disagreements about religion.
And okay, so I'm going to take the anti-natalism conversation. I'm going to pivot into I guess the last aspect that I found interesting to me, and maybe I want to hear your thoughts on it a little bit. But I know it doesn't directly concern you, because I know you're not a strict person who abides by the non-aggression principle. And well, one thing that struck me when I'm listening to David Benatar talk about this is, you have to think about how he will say things like, you didn't consent to be brought into this world, and stuff like that. So when I hear that type of language, it brings me back to certain principles for libertarianism, about how you shouldn't force things on people, and about consent and things like that. Now, I did see, and I wish I kept it on my screen, or I had it up on my phone for convenience, but there was a quote from Walter Block just defining the non-aggression principle, and it phrased it in the ways of saying it wasn't about violating people's consent, but it was more saying you can't do things that are violent to people or their property. And if you frame it in that way, then I don't see any reason why bringing somebody in the world is going to be something that you would consider a violation of the non-aggression principle. But you can't consent to being born. This is just something that you have to contend with. So I was thinking about this just because I think I guess it seems relevant in the anti-natalism conversation, to me at least, about the ethics, given that you can't consent to being born, and there are negative things that happen in the world. Now, in the Jordan Peterson, David Benatar discussion, there's a part where Jordan Peterson says that life is a gift and it's an opportunity. And then Dave Benatar is like, well, you're calling it an opportunity, but here's all the negative things about it. And it really is tricky because I think one of the reasons why the non-aggression principle can be more contentious than somebody like me would want to admit is because people interpret things as, negatives in different ways. Now, since most people end up perceiving life as a gift, and it's not because they don't have bad moments, but it's because most people don't in their heart of hearts believe that they wish they weren't born. And a lot of people will at some points in their life say that they wish they weren't born. And people, when you're at your lowest of lows, that's a very easy thought to have. But I think in the core of most people's days, they aren't wishing to not exist. A lot of people do for long stretches of time if they like hate their job, and that's a huge part of their life. But I wouldn't say that's the consensus view. So I guess maybe for the same reason that I wouldn't see it as a non-aggression principle violation to like give my roommate like a box of chocolate. Like he might hate that brand of chocolate and he might throw it in the trash. He might be like disgusted with me for getting him chocolate that was cheap or something as like a, to try to make amends for something. He could interpret it in a wrong way, but I don't think giving somebody a gift is a non-aggression principle violation, even though there's a chance that they might reject it or they might, be unhappy they got it. And I think that's the way I have to view the anti-natalism argument to not be an anti-natalist. But that's something I was thinking about a little bit. So I just want to throw that out there, see if you had any thoughts on it, because I, of course, had to, to take the conversation and try to tie it home to, my ANCAP views.
I mean, I guess the thing that interests me, I'll make a quick point and then I'm going to respond directly to what you just said. The thing that interests me about antinatalism is, and this is just true of various philosophies and worldviews. I like to think about it and kind of think about, why I might believe it or what the strongest arguments are for that worldview and whether or not, if I believed it, how would my life be different? Would those differences would I perceive them as good or bad, or would they be good or bad, from based on some, based on any broader ideas, or would it be beneficial to the world or other people around me if I did X, Y, or Z or didn't do X, Y, or Z? I can't say I'm in a place in life where like, I guess antinatalism makes sense to me from a personal standpoint. I can't speak for, what I'll believe 2 years, 5 years, or 10 years down the road, but, and that kind of brings me to the idea of like, I guess, bringing people into existence. So having children, and it's an uncontroversial statement that you can't ask people, do you want to be alive? Because you don't exist. If we had souls, maybe we could, and we had a way to communicate with those souls, we could contact the soul and be like, do you want to come into existence? But that's not the world we live in. However, I still don't come to the conclusion that it's necessarily that having children and bringing people in this world is like a negative act or an immoral act. But, and this is maybe where the utilitarian calculus does come in. I think you kind of have to evaluate the people involved, if they want to, if the couple involved, or if it's the people or person involved, they just have to, think about what kind of life will this child have? Will I be able to meet their needs? Will I have to give them up for adoption? Do I want to give them up for adoption? How is if I give them up for adoption, what kind of life will they lead at that point? Because in certain, so I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't think life, and this kind of goes back to, we've had another longstanding disagreement between us is on like the issue of abortion. And I think in the last episode I said something about life isn't always worth living, and I think that's true. But I think sometimes life is worth living. But like I mean, for example, not that I'm in not that I'm in a very committed relationship at the moment, but like I wouldn't have a child. I'm 21. I'm a college student. I wouldn't have a child now because that child would have a terrible life because I have no way to take care of a child right now. But if I, when I reach 31 and say I have a successful career and I'm happily married and I would be able to take care of his or her needs. If I were to choose, if the me and my future wife were to choose to have a child, then I would say, okay, that's not wrong or immoral to do it then. It's not irresponsible to do it then. That's not to say, again, that there are things outside our control, that the child could be born with certain illnesses or deformities, or and even if they're just a perfectly healthy person, both mentally and physically, there's still various minor or major sufferings, major suffering that everyone experiences, loss of a loved one or like unrequited love, just physical and mental pains that everyone has at some point. But I don't think just because there is suffering even in the best life, that doesn't, I don't think, invalidate why one would view life in a positive light, and I don't think that's an immoral act. The only time having a child would be an immoral act is if you are unable or unwilling to take care of the child, and and there's no other way to like make that child's life better. And I bring that up because you could not want, like a woman could get pregnant, but like, okay, she says, I don't want to have an abortion, but I'm but I'm not able to take care of the child right now. My sister, she can take care of my child, right? So okay, I'm gonna give birth to a child, and my sister's going to be his or her caretaker. So it's like, or again, I mean, even you can even give the child up for adoption. Although that, I mean, at some level, the being in that system can also lead it to its own suffering, but there's a possibility of the child finding a happier home that way. So you can, it's all about the kind of life the child will be able to lead and the various factors involving that when we're asking the question, should we or should we not bring people into this world?
So as you're saying that, it's so on the last episode we had Kohei on, and the whole episode he was the guest, and we essentially took his views and we grilled him on it. So right now I'm trying to do the same thing, but to David Benatar, who's not here. And if I was going to, I guess, be as ungenerous as possible to his argument, and and I would take out a lot of, I'm taking out a lot of his time to give evidence. But if I was going to overly summarize it, he's more saying there's pluses and minuses if you exist. If you don't exist, then there's the plus of not having the pain of existing, and there's no minus because you can't exist to feel the good stuff anyways. So you can't know what you're missing out on. I'm not convinced that plus is a plus. I'm not convinced that zero is a zero. But he's kind of saying that if you accept what he's saying, therefore he wins the tie, kind of, because you don't know if life's going to be good or bad, and you know that this one can only be good and it can't be bad. So at least this one has no chance of being negative. So go with that one. In the end, because I kind of reject, the way I see it is I more see it as you have the pluses and minuses of life that, depending on who's interpreting it, what happens, all sorts of situations, it can come out as an overall plus or an overall minus. You don't really know. And then I would consider the other one a complete zero. I would probably say an absence of pleasure is a zero, as an absence of pain is a zero, because you can't really know the pain you're missing out on or the pleasure you're missing out on. That might be an overly simplified way, but I can either see it squared as a plus and a minus or both zeros. I can't see it as the favorable calculation for himself. But I don't think the logical conclusion from a potential plus or minus versus zero is always pick the zero. And I think that's why in the end, it's like, I mean, obviously I'm not trying to have kids right now either, but so I think to some degree, his whole thesis is worth using because it's just bringing up this very valid point that not existing is a complex state. So this is one of my favorite points to bring up, and it is from that Sam Harris episode. I didn't hear it this time when I was re-listening to it because I only re-listened like the first half of it, but this always stuck with me. But I think Sam Harris makes a point like, okay, imagine you think killing animals is bad, so you stop eating meat. You don't like that all these cows are murdered, so you stop eating meat. Well, now what happens if everybody falls in suit and a lot less people are eating burgers and all and meat that comes from cows? Well, people stop breeding cows, so because nobody's buying their meat. So all the cows that were living a life for a certain amount of time, then being killed and then being eaten, are just never being born anymore. So what, it's not really that I think there's like a completely right way to interpret this, but you have to think, what does that even mean? So I think there's that way of thinking about the world that is an outgrowth of thinking about antinatalism. Because if those cows were never born, well, even though they were being slaughtered for food, some of them in some of the nicer farms just get fat, don't do anything, kind of have a chill time, and then they're abruptly murdered, and they aren't sentient enough to have the anxiety of knowing they're going to abruptly get murdered. So it's like, okay, well, is that better than them just never being born? So there's an interesting thing to think about, and it's just an interesting ethical dilemma. But I think that the part that I just draw the issue with is assuming that the tie goes to Benatar's right. And I know you're not saying that, but that's where I really discount his theory, because I think it brings a lot to the table in terms of just weird ways to think about existence and meaning. But I think he tries to put a bow on it in a way that I don't. It just seems to be arbitrary to me. But I think you're with me on that, Camp. So that was my last kind of tangent on that. Do you want to wrap this one up?
Oh yeah, I'll just add quickly. I like for clarification purposes. I don't think it's immoral to not have children. And I don't think it's immoral to have children, except in certain contexts. But I still think there are reasons why, perfectly valid reasons why someone might want to have children. And there are valid reasons for why someone would not want to have children. So, and when it comes to then the, I guess the question of like existence versus non-existence, I think the only reason to think much about non-existence would be, I think if the person, if there is an unbelievable amount of suffering, again, however we're evaluating whether the suffering or the pleasure is greater or lesser, that there are situations where the it would be better to not exist. So I guess my foot's in both camps. In other words, but that's why I'm not an anti-natalist. I see I see the value. I see certain. I would agree. Maybe I'll put it like this: like I might agree with David Benatar on like 50% of what he's saying. But I disagree with the conclusions he's drawing from that 50% of what he's saying, and I add another 50%, which is more like the Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson kind of side. An example where they actually agree, and so that's why I'm not an anti-natalist, either in philosophy or in practice, because one could be like, as I said in the earlier part of the episode, like, and this is a smug thing. An anti-natalist might view this as a smug thing to say, which is why I kind of didn't dwell on it much. But it's unlikely that we're ever going to have like mass anti-natalist policies passed. Like occasionally a country here and there will limit people's ability to have children, like in China, for example. But for the most part, people aren't going to take on this philosophy, because it just goes against people's intuitions, whether they're right or wrong. And for that reason, it's not really it's not a philosophy which can lead to many practical, like, socio-political programs put in place. I don't see the human race, for example, deciding, all right, um, we're gonna drive ourselves into extinction. We're all gonna stop having children, and then, everyone's eventually, the last people will die off, and then there will be no more people. Um, as long as there are people, there will be people who try to have children. And again, I'm not even saying I'm not making a moral judgment there, but I'm saying that's just kind of the fact of how what it means to be human beings, since human beings are animals.
But before I pivot into our other topic, that is interesting to point out, because I didn't think of it that way. But there isn't really any nation that has a agenda that anti-natalism would really fit. And I say that just because we've had a lot of episodes where we talk about like the neoliberal media establishment, and there's been a lot of environmental movements that have implied that humans are like the plague on the earth, like we are the scourge that destroys the planet. And there's some like anti-human undertones, but almost all the policies that neoliberals are in for are like really contingent on consistent population growth. So it's never really in any establishment from like an economic view, especially because of like government policies that are based on consistent economic growth, to like ever have a low birth rate. So it's kind of funny to think about anti-natalism and be like, yeah, there's like one narrative I could see adopting anti-natalism as like a way to try to push an idea, but like the overwhelming majority of things, like that would really hurt their cause. So yeah, and one of the videos you linked me to touched on that too at the end. But we're going to take a hard turn into jury nullification. And we're just going to talk a little bit about it just because it's an interesting topic that I pitched before. If you haven't heard of jury nullification, I wouldn't be super surprised because nobody ever talks about it. And it's something that I was introduced to pretty late. But the reason why we're talking about it is because it's kind of been something I've been interested in for a while, because it's one of the few ways that I can see an individual and the system making a difference. And not a lot of people know about it. So
I
I
just
think
want to add. I'm sorry, Matt. Don't mean to interrupt. I just want to add to a quick statement to anyone listening to this. Um, I'm under the impression, from the little research I have done, um, just by listening to this episode on jury nullification can invalidate your ability to be on a jury. So if you like, and most people don't care, but if you were one of those people who wants to be on a jury, maybe it would be best if you did not listen to it. That's just an FYI, because obviously when you're in a jury, they talk to you and they say, do you have any beliefs which would prevent you from judging this case based solely on the law and the Constitution and whatnot. And if you're sitting there thinking to yourself, yeah, well, I think there should be more if you're sitting there thinking about jury nullification, then that kind of invalidates your ability to your answer to their question would have to be no if you don't want to be convicted of perjury. So that's just kind of a little statement out there that I thought I should say.
So I'm going to allow Matt to cover himself by saying that, but I'm going to intentionally obfuscate what he just said, because one of the cool things about everything around jury nullification is it's something that appears to be valid in terms of thinking about things constitutionally. And a lot of things that the court will say to jurors doesn't actually have any like legal jurisprudence. It's just a matter of what they say. So you can actually, a lot of the questions they'll ask, and I'm saying this because there's a specific example I heard about on a podcast that comes to mind with you giving that example. But in your mind, if they ask you, can you take part in this case honest and fairly and judge it accordingly? Well, honest and fairly could be you invalidating the trial because you don't think the person should be allowed to be tried for a certain law. So there has been a person, I think it was, there's a podcast, I don't actually listen to it, which is kind of bad that I'm name dropping it for this reason, but it's the Rollo and Slappy show. And they're two ANCAPs, and one of them, I believe, was on a jury in Philadelphia, which was interesting to me because it's very close to where I am. And he was on and I guess this will explain what jury nullification is. But so the process of jury nullification is essentially voting no that a person is guilty purely because what they're attempting to convict them on is something you don't think should be a crime. And it's something that you're allowed to do. And you can easily cause mistrials by essentially saying, I don't think this law should be a crime, so I'm never going to vote that that person is guilty of it. And there was a huge case where they tried, I think, half a dozen people on drug-related charges, and one of the people on it pretty much voted no on all the people for anything that was relevant to like possession, because he didn't think that anybody should be charged for possession. And he was able to get a couple people off completely. He was able to get a couple mistrials, and then I think he was so he could make progress with his other jurors. He did vote one person guilty, because the other two people who got off completely would have ended up as mistrials. But it's something that can be used by a juror if they're aware of it. The biggest legal issues that have happened around jury nullification have been about specifically witness tampering, because there have been specific cases where there's been like, say, I don't even know what the case is off the top of my head, but there's a specific big court case in a region, and then a bunch of people showed up and tried to give those jurors who are already selected information about jury nullification, all in relation to a specific case. So those people got in trouble for like tampering with the trial. That's the more contentious thing that's happened. But overall, it's like a really, really big gray area that most people don't talk about. So that's kind of the intro I would start with. So I'll pass it over to you.
So I began, or I interjected that PSA for the very reason that I think, from what I know about jury nullification so far, and again, I let you know there's not that much information about it online. Maybe if I really do a hard deep dive into the depths of the internet, I'll find much more. But like a quick Google search, or or a quick search on like YouTube or whatnot, won't get you that much information. But I can't find myself, and this is going to be an example where you're like, Matt, why are you doing this? You're a fool. But I can't find myself giving a hard yes or hard no on the topic of jury nullification. And I say that because, one, I believe that the citizens of a country need to have ways to be able to respond to unjust laws and correct unjust laws, because the law is not in and of itself correct just because it's the law. And the second thing is, I don't think it can be easy to, and forgive me, I'm not trying to straw man like the libertarian position here, but it can be easy to say, well, the only reason people don't talk about jury nullification, the only reason lawyers and judges don't talk about jury nullification is because they're self-interested weasels who have no moral compass, and they want to keep you blind. They want to keep you from knowing your constitutional rights. I'm simplifying the argument terribly, so forgive me, but I can't sit here and be like, yeah, that's true, jury nullification all the way, because the reason that, or a reason, I guess I should say, a reason that judges and lawyers don't often tell jurors about jury nullification is just due to the inner workings of the law itself. So in other words, a system of laws, despite the fact that it's not always just or morally correct, it has its own little way of functioning. And you have to, at least from my perspective, you have to give them that. You have to understand how the law functions in and of itself in order to be able to evaluate the immorality or the morality of law. So that would be, those are my opening statements.
So, okay. So I have two things. So, okay. So the main reason I'm very much in favor of jury nullification Well, I guess there's so many reasons why I'm very in favor of jury nullification, but one is because there is an ethos of democracy that I like as much as I trash democracy, and the ethos of democracy I like is it's supposed to empower the individual, and I think a lot of people appeal to democracy because it's supposed to make the one person, have a say in things, and I just don't see that in the governments that people actually call democratic often at all. I think voting isn't empowering in any capacity, but I think things like when you buy things, I think that's much more democratic in the sense of empowering an individual. So now when we talk about things like jury nullification, I think that is by far the biggest check you can give to an individual in a society to say a law is dumb or broken or wrong. And I don't think you need to understand a legal code to know if a law seems wrong to you. Now, I will say we have, and I think one of the reasons why it's not popular is because the judges and lawyers are corrupt. I mean, because I think if that whole argument really stops, because even getting to a trial is like impossible nowadays. So a lot of the corruption goes on outside of the actual room. It goes to how almost nothing goes to a trial anymore. Everything is somebody pleading guilty way ahead of time because they're threatened with so much. Now, actually, in the courts, I think a lot of people aren't aware of it. It doesn't suit people's interest to know about it. And it's something that is in an ambiguous area. So you'd need an information campaign to let people know it if they're not going to tell you about it. And it causes mistrials. That's inconvenient to court systems. People in courts don't want mistrials. Then they have to do retrials. That's annoying. But the thing is, if you're on a jury and the person is going to be locked in a cage for years because of a law that seems stupid to you, then there's no reason why, even if the evidence shows they did it, you should say, yeah, lock them in the cage. And it's a veto. It's a veto for an individual on the jury to say, you know what? You can't lock them in a cage for that reason. And I'm not going to go along with it. And it's like the ultimate empowering moment that's still left in our system. And our system doesn't have a lot of, I hate our system. And this is one of the few things that's left in it. It makes me want to serve in a jury, even though I already know I wouldn't be selected because I have family members in law enforcement. And that's how they weed out so many people. So I don't think I'll ever get to sit on jury, but if I did, that'd probably be the most influential thing I could do in a moment for somebody's life. You can stop somebody who's going to lose 10 years of their life because they had a certain amount of cocaine on them from ever serving time in a cage, because you can just say, you know what? I don't care that that guy was going to do cocaine. I don't care if you have the proof that he was going to do it. I don't care if you pulled him over and found it in his car. He's not going to jail. I say no. You're going to have to find somebody else to be complicit. But I have the button here. I'm going to press the button every time. And I don't think appeals to legal codes is even relevant to consider. So I think that's where my big disconnect with what you just said is.
I mean, I think I agree with your evaluation of jury nullification. Or I agree with the what you said about the democratic element to it, which is why I said law needs to be responsive to the average person. But I'm thinking of, when I think about like the history of jury nullification, there have been two examples, like two situations where jury nullification was used. One which is everyone would say was great, and the other everyone would say is terrible. And the good example would be when a jury got when there was a trial about like a runaway slave, and the jury set the slave free. Like the jury, like the slave was guilty of running away, so under the slave laws, he or she was guilty. He or she should have been punished, and the jury was like, no, we don't believe in slavery. He's free, or she's free. And everyone's like, that's wonderful. Jury nullification is great. But then you get the examples where there was someone convicted of lynching, and obviously lynching is and what is a crime and has been a crime for a long time, and the jury was like, no, we for racist reasons. Oh, no, set him free. It doesn't matter if he lynched someone. But so there's the issue, because the jury nullification can be used for almost any purpose. Like whatever opinion you have, no matter how insane it is, if we open up Pandora's box and we say jury nullification's okay in all matters, then then we open ourselves to the possibility of people who have atrocious beliefs imposing those atrocious beliefs onto the broader community. That's why it's not possible for me to say, for me to be completely in one camp or the other. Go ahead.
Okay, so that was a bad example. And the reason it was a bad example is because there have been plenty of times where there have been racist murderings and then the jury just doesn't convict. And that's not because they're being jury nullifiers. It's just because they go, oh, I'm not going to convict that guy because he killed a black dude and I don't care about black people because I'm a racist in the 1700s or 1800s, right? So those people weren't using jury nullification by saying, I think murder is okay, therefore this law is invalid. They were just all acting as a bad jury because they're all racist. That's not the principle of jury nullification. The principle of jury nullification would be saying, I don't think murder should be a federal crime, so we're going to so we're not going to enforce murder. Those people in the example of bigotry are just saying, I'm a bigot, so I'm just going to ignore the evidence. I think.
But what I'm saying is, you can use like,
and that's the same case against democracy. I'm against democracy because Jim Crow laws.
You can use jury nullification.
You know what? You can't be in favor of government because government did a bad thing. It's just the argument you're making is not. You can make it for anything because everything's been used for a bad purpose at some point. It doesn't mean jury nullification as a tool doesn't make sense.
No, what I'm saying is I'm not willing to be completely in favor of it or completely against it because it can be used for both good and bad ends. Like in that context for the act of jury nullification, that I think that applies. I don't think we need to extrapolate from democracy and government and other things. That's irrelevant.
Well, it's the same argument type. Is what I'm saying.
I'm not saying inherent jury nullification. I'm stuttering. I'm not saying bigotry is inherent in jury nullification. I'm saying jury nullification can be used to support any political opinion. It doesn't matter what it is.
I'm willing to accept that that's true. Yes.
So then at that point, again, we're evaluating what kind of society do we want to live in?
Okay,
and if we allow jury
nullification, I have a way of reframing this. I have a way of reframing it that'll be helpful.
When do we allow it and when do we not allow it? Do we allow it all the time? Do we never allow it?
So I think that there's a crucial part of jury nullification that makes it better than most of the other things. That makes it better than most other systems. This is something constructive to talk about. It causes a mistrial. If you vote, say. So what happens a lot of times in jury nullification is the evidence shows that somebody's guilty. And then there's one person who says, I'm not going to vote he's guilty because that law is stupid. So it's not usually like the 9 racists that all vote no because they're all a league of racists. It's usually something like one person says, I'm against the drug war, so this is bad. So I don't care that he's guilty. He's not guilty. And then cause a mistrial. Well, it does have a check because even if I agree with that, it has a check because if the district attorney wants to do a retrial, they can just do a retrial. They can get 9 new jurors and they can say, well, these people couldn't make an agreement, so we're going to retry them. So if it's something, and this is why I think it's such an important tool, is if we know that a ton of Americans are against the drug war, and we can just tell them, hey, if you're ever on a jury for these drug war related things, you're allowed to vote no just because it's drug war related, then it's an actual good use of it that I think we would agree on. It's a nonviolent crime where you can keep people out of prison. You can just force retrials and they'll go, well, we know we're not going to get a guilty conviction in this county, so they're going to stop enforcing it. But then if then there's a random fluke case in 2021 where someone says, oh, well, I'm going to cause a mistrial because I'm glad Derek Chauvin killed George Floyd, well, then they'll retry it because it's the kind that you can't go to a mistrial on and not have it retried because it was such an outlier, I guess. So if somebody says, well, I think everybody should be allowed to shoot people in the head in the public square, and then they nullify the court, well, then they'll just retry it and then it'll go through because that's very unpopular. But things like the drug war is something that is very, very popular to be against these types of nonviolent drug offenses. So there is a check there. It's not like a lot of other slow types of government that are imposed very slowly from the top down and are allegedly representative, but then it takes decades. Like, if it's popular and you have the people informed, only popular things will get nullified. consistently, or else they'll just retry them until they get the right decision that they want. I think that's a unique distinction why jury nullification is effective and still democratic.
Well, I mean, like I said, I'm also not here to say jury nullification is not, it cannot be a net benefit. You know, and like when I was, and so again, going back to the little PSA, I said, I didn't say that to say don't do it. I said, what I was saying was, if you're going on a jury specifically to nullify the law, you're technically committing a crime. Just know what just know what you're getting into.
You're not, though.
Well, no, you
It's
are.
it depends on the jurisdiction.
No.
No, it does. It does.
You are in the sense that you could be convicted of perjury because if you're lying about why you're getting on the jury in the first place.
Well, yeah, but no. It depends on the phrasing of the question, though. No, this is really contentious. So don't say that like you know it. This is argued about by like legal scholars.
It's like when I said that when they ask you, do you have any beliefs that will prevent you from judging this case based on the law?
I would say no.
If you say no and you believe and you're getting on the jury specifically for jury nullification,
no, because I think jury nullification is legal and of the law. So you can't. Well, somebody could, but then you have a case against it. It hasn't been convicted. It's not something that people have been getting convicted of.
You can be convicted of perjury for jury nullification. You definitely can.
Yeah. See, I've heard people getting in trouble for witness tampering by informing people of jury nullification. But the way that they phrase the questions, jury nullification isn't something that's not lawful. So if you say that you're still judging the case on the merits of the case given the law, then if you know your rights as a juror to nullify it, then you can say yes. Because even if you're going to go up there and you're going to say, well, that's stupid, I'm not convicting him of drug law, then you're still doing that on the merits of the law because you're allowed to do that. So you can use the law to invalidate the law. So you're still judging it based on the case and based on the law. This is something that like a ton of people who are, especially in libertarian circles, because it is a thing that libertarians who are like against the drug war want to use, debate all the time. So it's not a thing that where people are getting, are nullifying courts then immediately getting thrown in a cage for perjury or getting put on trial for perjury. That's like a legal argument that's happening up and above things. I just don't. I don't think people should shy away from being selected on a jury for that reason. I think you can honestly answer it truthfully and say, yes, I will judge the case on the merits, and then still nullify it.
I mean, I'm not gonna. I don't think I'm not communicating properly, so I'm not gonna go down that rabbit hole. I'm gonna move on to something else quickly. The issue with okay, so jury nullification kind of gets at the heart of the like how one views law. And now, depending on whether you believe in government or not, you could say there can be laws with government or laws without government, et cetera, et cetera. But the thing is, I think there are examples where there's something in law, and most people can agree on this. Some people can't, though. That's the issue. But most people can agree there are certain laws that we have in place that are examples of moral principles which should not be violated. And so I think nullification, it would be wrong to nullify a just law. And so then you have to evaluate again, what kind of society do you want to live in? Is this law justified? Is it not justified? Does it go against my moral principles, or is it in favor of my moral principles? And I'm not gonna bring up examples because that's too obvious. But like that is the reason why I think we have to think about why like thinking about law is important at all. Because again, law is not equal to morality, but law can be an extension of morality. So it's not as if law means nothing. It's not as if law means everything. I sound like a centrist in this episode, and I don't know why. But you have to pick and choose. You have to use critical thinking skills. You have to evaluate. In certain instances, I would say it is correct. It is morally correct to nullify the law, even if in certain jurisdictions you could be punished for it. And then there are other examples when attempts to nullify the law would be immoral because the law is just. Um, and so that's the tricky waters that I find myself in when we're having this conversation.
Yeah, I think I think I'm somewhat incorrectly getting upset at you here, and I say somewhat because I think part of it is just my assumption. We agree on this. I think that's why I decided based on what you just said. The way you're phrasing it makes me feel like you're not agreeing with me, but I think you're just saying something that is so obvious to me, like the root of it, that obviously I agree with it, and I think you're trying to say more, which is why I keep thinking you're disagreeing with me. Yeah, if I'm on a murder trial and the dude killed his wife, and it's like, yeah, here's the 5 bullets, here's the gun registered to him, and he has no alibi, and he's pleading not guilty, but has not made a case for why he's not there, and there's all this proof that shows he killed her. Then it's like, just because it's the law and I hate the government doesn't mean I'm going to nullify it. I'm not. If you're pro jury nullification, you're not for every jury trial ending in nullification. There's nobody arguing for that, as far as I know. And I kind of, at first, I think I interpreted you as making the case that somewhat more directly against jury nullification because it undermines the law. And I think that's an argument that I kind of expected you to maybe lean more towards than you have. So maybe I was using my brain to impose that on what you're saying. So I interpreted it through a lens that was more against jury nullification. But you're saying exactly what I'm saying. It's just almost the part that goes without saying. Yeah, if you decide that a law is immoral, then you should use jury nullification and say, oh, hey, I think this law is stupid. It's bad for all these reasons. I can't believe we made it so somebody owns a Quran, the government should execute them. I'm going to nullify that. And then you'd be like, yeah, me too. But if the law is something where it's like, yeah, he clearly committed armed robbery on this bank, I still think we should put him in a cage because he did armed robbery on a bank. Then maybe you don't nullify that case. Yeah, I think that kind of goes without saying though. So I don't know if there's more getting to that than you are. I wouldn't call you a fence sitter though if that's your stance. Then I would say you're in favor of jury nullification because everything that I think we agree on right now kind of goes without saying. Nobody's arguing for jury nullification for murderers. I mean, I kind of might get there because I hate the government, but it's because I want people. If the government wasn't there, we'd have another mechanism to resolve these situations. We don't have another mechanism to resolve these situations, so I don't want to nullify it just because then they'd go free. And I think that's probably worse than a murderer being put in a cage.
I guess I'll add this, and then we can wrap up if you want. But I mean, the idea of jury nullification, it's very old, and it goes back to various trials in English common law. And I think probably the issue comes in, there's just been an increased, or that there has been an increase in bureaucracy in the law, which causes people to, which kind of imposes social norms on the law and imposes social norms within the courtroom that aren't necessarily related to the law itself, but are related to the bureaucracy that has been built around the law and around the courts. So I think that if there's any disconnect, that has to play a major part of it. But I no, I think we do actually agree on this. And it's because of the point you made about my thought process in related to the individual, the law needing to be responsive to the individual, because the law is not just above the individual in just because it's the law. So
Now,
in the sense that jury nullification is democratic, I guess I would say I am at least for it in theory. In practice, it gets tricky, but I'm willing to say in theory, I'm moderately in favor of it.
now this is a random bit of analysis before we wrap up. I just want to throw out there, but it is curious to me And this is the mildly conspiratorial, but it's just like I think it's clear to us, you and I at least, that a lot of the media landscape and the political landscape is based on narratives that are kind of consciously shaped. Like that's how like a lot of events are amplified if they fit a narrative and stuff like that. And it's just curious to me how little the legal system is touched on beyond prisons, because we always talk about disproportionate. They always talk about disproportionate rates of people of color in prisons and certain types of police interactions with them, people of color, but they don't. I guess what I'm getting at is that the social justice narrative could easily dominate the discourse when it comes to jury nullification. You can talk about how all sorts of people don't get trials, and that all sorts of people should be getting trials, and then we can put good liberals, good Democrats on those trials to nullify these unfair laws against minority communities. But we don't hear that narrative. And I'm not saying it's because there's anything malicious there. Maybe they just don't think that's worth it, or maybe it's too niche. But I'd hope, just because jury nullification is just so empowering, that I hope that even if there are some narratives out there I disagree with, I hope somebody co-ops jury nullification as a tool, because I think it's a valuable tool when it comes to empowering an individual in a system that goes out of its way to disempower people at all turns. So that's why I think at least it's something to keep your eye on, or it's at least kind of weird to think, well, maybe jury nullification does scare the government, because maybe they think that they open up that Pandora's box. Maybe they're worried that then right-wingers will nullify gun laws or something like that. But then the same can be said, and I think I brought this up to you offline, about sanctuary cities, and how there are certain states that have said, we're not going to enforce federal gun laws because we just refuse to. So that's the state nullification angle on laws, but you can see how this kind of plays into jury nullification. But I think there's a lot there to kind of just, I guess, be on watch for. So that's the last commentary I wanted to do. Do you want to add anything on that note? Okay. Well, I appreciate you guys listening to this one. I know we did a little bit of yelling, but I think we hit our quota for episodes without me yelling. I did a little bit actually at Kohei last episode, but if you ignore that, I don't think I yelled at you in maybe 4 episodes, and that might even be a record. So I hope you guys, I hope you appreciated us talking past each other a little bit, but mostly getting to the heart of the issues. And I know anti-natalism to jury nullification is kind of a abrupt swing on things. But you can check out 50 other past episodes in our backlog on YouTube or on any podcatcher, since this is episode 51. You can find more of my insipid commentary at the Obey Podcast or the Obey Podcast on any podcatcher. And I think I have most of my episodes on YouTube at this point. That's more politically oriented and current events oriented. And you can find Matt and his content. He has a YouTube channel, The Anti-Philosopher, where he posts videos talking about issues and him reviewing books and the things of that like. So you can find all of our content all around the internet. And you can find me on Twitter at Matthew T. Keck or at the Obey Podcast if you want to get in touch and tell me that I was wrong on everything. But until next week, when we argue about something new, sign off. It's Matt and Matt. Thank you.